Hello YouTube. Welcome to my stream where I rank the Star Wars films and TV shows. I'd like to start this off by saying that we're going to have different opinions on these pieces of content, especially films and sequel trilogy. That's totally fine. Let's just respect each other's differing opinions and not say to someone else, you're not a real fan if you have an opinion that's different than the ones I have, or there's something wrong with you, you're a moron because you have a different opinion than me. No, let's not do that. But with that out of the way, let's get started. Coming in at number 21 will be The Rise of Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. I know that there will be confusion over why I'm placing The Rise of Skywalker below The Last Jedi, which I do understand. The Last Jedi is a film that leaves more of a sour taste in my mouth, and I don't feel like it belongs. But the reason why I'm placing Rise of Skywalker in last place is because this is the movie that Disney promoted as the end of the Skywalker saga, but yet it's so lazy and so messy. This is a story that has been going on for about 40 years, and so this movie really needed to deliver. It was very important for it to deliver because many people are very emotionally invested in the Skywalker saga, and yet this movie is so lazy that it brings back Emperor Palpatine. There are many problems with this. For one, looking back on the sequel trilogy now that's over, it's so obvious that this was not the plan from the beginning, because when you look at The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, along with books, comics, video games that came out the before The Rise of Skywalker came out, Palpatine's return was not foreshadowed at all. It's obvious that J.J. Abrams didn't like that Rian Johnson killed off Snoke because he thought, oh no, the big bad overlord villain of this trilogy was killed off in The Last Jedi. So who's going to be the big overlord now? Can't be Kylo Ren because he's conflicted. Can't be Hux because The Last Jedi turned him into an incompetent buffoon. So it'll be Palpatine. How do you come back? It doesn't matter. We're just going to bring him back. That points to one of the biggest problems of this film is that it's so obvious that J.J. Abrams wanted to completely retcon The Last Jedi with this movie because he didn't like what Rian Johnson did. And that points to one of the fundamental problems of the sequel trilogy as a whole, which is that there was no plan from the beginning. And so the trilogy ended up being a mess that lacked any cohesion or consistency. So The Last Jedi takes the trilogy in a wildly different direction, but then The Rise of Skywalker comes in and just completely retcons The Last Jedi. Another problem with bringing back Palpatine is one that I mentioned briefly earlier, which is that the movie doesn't explain how it is that Palpatine came back. The reason why this is important is because in Return of the Jedi, Palpatine is thrown down a shaft by Darth Vader, and then he falls down this big shaft. We see all this blue energy, and then the second Death Star blows up like a minute later. And yet, this movie doesn't give us any actual explanation for how Palpatine comes back. We hear Resistance members say, dark science, cloning, secrets only the Sith knew. By the way, it's ridiculous to say that Sith were the only ones who knew about cloning because the Kaminoans were the ones who actually created the clone army that ended up being used by the Republic during the Clone Wars. So that was a laughable line. And then when Kylo Ren gets to Exegol, we hear the line that Palpatine said in Revenge of the Sith: the dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural. And then Palpatine says, I've died before. None of that actually explains how Palpatine survived getting thrown down that shaft in Return of the Jedi. Also, Palpatine is so stupid in The Rise of Skywalker. For one, you'd think that Palpatine would realize that it would probably be a good idea to not invite my enemies to attack me while my fleet is vulnerable and not ready to actually attack the galaxy. Also, if I don't tell the galaxy that I'm back and that I'm about to attack, and I use my fleet to attack the galaxy while the galaxy is completely unprepared, then I could easily defeat my enemies. No, instead, Palpatine, for some reason, immediately shoots himself in the foot and undermines his own plan by announcing to everyone that I'm back and I'm going to bring tyranny back by subjugating the galaxy once again. And on top of that, he leaves behind a clue of breadcrumbs that will lead straight back to Exegol. So he not only tells everyone that he's back, but he also invites everyone to attack him before his fleet is ready. Then in the third act, Palpatine does the same thing. He once again shoots himself in the foot because he tells Rey, if you kill me, my spirit will pass into you. If Palpatine had just kept his big mouth shut and then goaded Rey into killing him, she might have killed him and then he could have possessed her body and then he would have won. But for some reason, he feels the need to blab about this possession, and therefore Rey ends up defeating him. Also, what I find comical is that while Palpatine's body is being disintegrated because he's using Force Lightning, since Rey is using the lightsabers to deflect it back at him, Palpatine doesn't think, I could not use the Force Lightning. I could use the Force in a different way. I could whip out a lightsaber or and try to force pull one of Rey's lightsabers to me. No, instead, for some reason, he just continues to use the Force Lightning, even though it's killing him. Especially comical considering that in Revenge of the Sith, when Palpatine fires lightning at Windu, his face is disfigured. And then in Return of the Jedi, when he uses it against Luke, he's thrown down a shaft by Darth Vader. So even though using Force Lightning backfired horribly 2 times before, he still does it anyway. Hey, Derpy 501st. I don't like the sequels. I haven't gotten to all of them yet. I haven't gotten to Solo yet. What I'll say for now is that I don't think it's as bad as the sequel trilogy, but it's a film I find just in general to be rather generic and forgettable. But continuing on with what I was saying about The Rise of Skywalker, the other big problem here is that the film goes by so fast. Hey, oh, yeah, I agree. Yeah, Derby, I agree. Andor was a great show. It's unfortunate that not too many people are watching it. I think there are several reasons why that's the case, but quality wise, I think it is a great show. Admittedly, there are other shows that are Star Wars shows that are more fun or entertaining to watch, but Andor is a very well written show. But the thing about The Rise of Skywalker is that it goes by so fast. It goes at such a breathneck speed that you can never catch your breath or keep up with what's going on because the pacing is bad. Plus, the movie is structured like a bad RNG fetch quest where the characters keep running around searching for various items or they're trying to get something. Yeah, Kenobi is a show that I'm actually just about to get to. It's a show that I'm not a big fan of. When it comes to the prequels, I'm not a big fan of them. But there's nothing wrong with having nostalgia for films. So I totally get what you're saying there. Yeah, I liked Mando. That's a one that's going to be high up on the list. I liked season 2 as well as season 1, though admittedly season 2 was more simplistic. So I don't know if it was as good as season 1, even though it had great moments for sure. But at the end of Rise of Skywalker, we hear the voices of all the dead Jedi, but we don't actually get to see the Force ghost of Anakin or Obi-Wan or Yoda or any of them show up on screen. And I found that to be so disappointing. In fact, with the sequel trilogy as a whole, what baffles me is that Anakin Skywalker, the main character of episodes 1 to 6, the character who those movies were about, is so utterly sidelined in the sequel trilogy. We don't even hear the name Anakin Skywalker mentioned one time throughout the entire sequel trilogy. We don't get to see Anakin's Force Ghost. It was so disappointing to me. Also, it really bummed me out that Ben ended up being killed, because I think what would have been much more interesting is if the character had survived the Rise of Skywalker, and then Ben Solo had to live with the fact that he did all these horrible things and that he has to actually make up for them. I think it would have been much more interesting if we had seen, Kylo Ren become Ben Solo again, but then Ben Solo lives and has to actually figure out, how do I actually make up for all the horrific crimes that I committed as Kylo Ren? What is it like to actually live with the knowledge of everything that I did while I was with the First Order? Instead, it played out exactly like Vader's story did in the original trilogy, where Vader becomes Anakin and then he dies. In fact, the thing that disappointed me the most about the character of Kylo Ren slash Ben Solo is that he ended up being such a carbon copy of Anakin. Once again, we have the same story about someone who was originally a Jedi, but then was corrupted, fell to the dark side, became a Sith, or at least a dark side Force user, but then ultimately was redeemed. But moving on, coming in at number 20, we have Kenobi. I know some of you might be thinking, why is this show so low? Well, the reason for that is because I found Kenobi to be so frustrating, because it had great moments, great sequences, but it also had such lazy writing as well. You start with, in episode 1, the chase scene is laughably bad. For one, Leia starts running, and it's only then that these bounty hunters who are trying to capture her actually start running to try to grab Leia. For some reason, they give her a head start rather than immediately trying to capture her. And then for some reason, this little girl is outrunning all these adults. And there's even this moment where Leia ducks under a tree, and then an adult bumps into a tree branch, is like, "Oh, how could I possibly get around this branch? Oh, it's not like I could jump over it or go around it. No, I can't possibly get past this branch." And then in episode 3, we see Kenobi shoot this electric barrier to get around it, except him and Leia could have, just gone around it. It's so laughable that Kenobi's like, "Oh, how could I possibly get around this little fence? It's not like I could, go around it or anything. No, I guess I have to shoot it so we can just walk through it. And then in episode 4, Tala is trying to escape from these two stormtroopers, and the way she does it is she open hand slaps one of the stormtroopers. it is it is a comical moment. I remember watching that, and I just started bursting out laughing because I was like, what am I watching? I thought I was watching a live action show with a big budget, but am I actually just watching a low budget cartoon? And then after that, Kenobi's idea of how to get Leia off this base where there's Imperials everywhere is to stuff Leia in his trench coat. Once again, it's a comical moment. It's like, what? This is so over the top. This feels straight out of a cartoon. The Kenobi thinks this is going to work. With Imperials everywhere, he's just going to stuff Leia in his trench coat, and he just expects no one to notice. And then Reva tries to stop Kenobi and all the others from escaping, but then they do end up escaping, and then Vader confronts Reva, but for some reason he doesn't immediately kill her. He's suddenly gracious and merciful. He lets her explain. Also, in episode 3, the Empire is looking for Kenobi. Kenobi and Leia are on this planet. They go on this transport, and then the stormtroopers come on to the transport. Stormtroopers say, we're looking for a Jedi, that Jedi being Kenobi, but they seem to have no idea of what this Jedi looks like. It's like, really? The Empire would just say, look for this Jedi, but we're not going to give you any kind of description whatsoever about what this Jedi looks like. They didn't send out a picture of Obi-Wan, which we know they have because we see that in this series. They have a picture of Kenobi, but for some reason they don't send it out. They don't send it out to the stormtroopers. It is a comical moment. And then in the season finale, Vader and Kenobi have a fight, which admittedly is well choreographed. But right after this lightsaber fight is done, Obi-Wan decides to allow Vader to live. I don't get that at all. Because for one, Obi-Wan literally watches Vader murder innocent people in this series just for the sake of drawing him out. Obi-Wan sees of his own eyes that Vader has no problem with murdering innocent men, women, and children. He literally watches Vader snap a child's neck, kill other innocent people just to draw him out. And let's also not forget, Obi-Wan knows what Anakin did during Order 66. He knows that Anakin killed the Jedi back then, including the younglings, aka children. Also, at this point, Vader has been serving the Empire for about 10 years, so who knows how many innocent people he's killed. And also, you'd think that Obi-Wan would realize the right thing to do would be to kill this evil Sith Lord right here and now in order to prevent him from killing more innocent people in the future. But instead, for some reason, Obi-Wan just allows him to live. Now, of course, from an out-of-universe perspective, we as the audience know that Vader literally can't die here because he appears in the original trilogy and Kenobi is set before the original trilogy. But looking at this from purely an in-universe perspective, it's completely nonsensical that Obi-Wan just decides to let Vader live, even though he knows that Vader has committed all these crimes, and he knows that Vader will certainly do more of this in the future, but yet he just decides to allow Vader to live. This means in the future, any bloodshed is partially Kenobi's fault because he did not kill Vader when he had the chance. And so Obi-Wan Kenobi is guilty of allowing evil to continue via inaction. Now, I don't like to think that that's something that Obi-Wan is guilty of. He's supposed to be one of the great heroes of Star Wars. He's supposed to be someone with great morality. But as far as I'm concerned, this action in Kenobi hurts that. And I also and I don't get why it is that the writers didn't simply rewrite the scene so that Obi-Wan doesn't let Vader live, but instead is forced to let Vader live because he's chased off or something like that. So not only is Kenobi a frustrating show, but I also was very disappointed in it because I feel like it had the potential to be an A plus tier show, but instead it only ended up being a C minus tier show as far as I'm concerned. One of the big reasons why this show disappointed me is that we saw so little of prequel era Anakin. Don't get me wrong, I like seeing prequel era Anakin again, but in this series, we only saw him for one episode. Outside of that, we saw, for brief moments in time, we saw Vader without the mask, and in the finale, Obi-Wan slashes Vader's mask, which is cool because you see partially the Vader mask, partially Anakin's face, and the voice switches between James Earl Jones Vader and Hayden Christensen Anakin. I like that, but I found it to be so disappointing that we didn't get more flashbacks to the prequel era, that this show in and of itself didn't do more to flesh out Obi-Wan and Anakin's relationship. I'm disappointed that this wasn't more the focus of the show. And I was also really disappointed that we barely saw Qui-Gon's Force Ghost. We saw him at the very end, but it would have been much more interesting to have a series that focused more on Obi-Wan's training to become a Force Ghost. That would be really interesting, especially considering what we learn about Force Ghost in the Clone Wars. But instead, the series focused more on spectacle than substance. It focused more on including the things that would get the audience excited, like Darth Vader, Obi-Wan, all these bright, flashy things are going to get people excited, rather than the deeper stuff that would make the show better. I'm disappointed that Disney chose to make a show based more on attracting as many people as possible rather than telling as good of a story as possible. In fact, I think that Andor really shows problem with Kenobi because Andor is a show that focuses on substance rather than spectacle, while Kenobi is a show that focuses on spectacle over substance. Also, when it comes to Kenobi, I do like Obi-Wan's arc of him at first being guilty of and filled with trauma about everything that's gone down, him struggling with PTSD, but then in the later episodes, we see him come back. We see him pulling out his lightsaber, being that being that Jedi Master again. But, however, it left me really disappointed that the show did not focus more on developing Obi-Wan's character, really exploring his trauma and him being able to process that and him somewhat getting past that. Also, when it comes to young Leia, I like the performance. I don't have a problem with the actress that played her, but the problem here is that when you watch A New Hope, you don't get the feeling at all that Leia knows Obi-Wan personally. It's more like you feel more like Leia knows about Obi-Wan, knows who he is, but hasn't really met him before. Because when she sends him that message, it's very formal. And then, yeah, when Luke first mentions Obi-Wan, Leia gets excited, but then she doesn't show much concern for him at all. So then it doesn't make sense when you learn in Kenobi that, oh, Leia and Obi-Wan got to know each other rather well. They went on this whole adventure together. He even saved her life. What I also find to be really baffling about Kenobi is that even though it's only 6 episodes long, that's really short, only 6 episodes, and it still had a filler episode in the form of episode 4, which just didn't matter, completely throwaway. And the series, despite being so short, still felt stretched out because it repeated plot points. For example, Leia being captured. That happened at the end of episode 1, and then it happened again in episode 3. And then you have the plot point of Leia being rescued. That happened in episode 2, and then it happened again in episode 5. And then when it comes to the character of Reva, I like the idea of Reva's character, the idea of a Padawan that was supposed to die in Order 66, but instead ended up surviving and hates Vader because of what he did back then, so wants to get revenge against him. That's an idea worth exploring. That's interesting. But the problem here is that the series fails to understand that her motivations are so glaringly and obviously nonsensical and hypocritical. What I mean by that is that Reva Reva is saying, I want to avenge the killing of Jedi. I'm going to avenge the killing of Jedi by killing even more Jedi. She ends up becoming Inquisitor. I'm going to avenge the killing of children by killing more children. That is complete nonsense. Yeah, you can say that Revo's corrupted by the dark side, but I don't think that's good enough. The show fails to address the fact that her motivations are so glaringly and obviously nonsensical and hypocritical. But however, when it comes to things I like about the show, I think it's cool seeing Vader in full rage mode. I enjoy seeing that. And I also like what we saw of Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru in the show. They didn't have too much screen time, but I think the screen time they did have left an impression. For example, in episode 1, you see that even though Reva puts a lightsaber to Owen Lars's throat, he never gives up Luke. Even though, for all he knew at the time, Reva could have decapitated him, stabbed him in the chest, or horribly tortured him. But despite that, he never gives up Luke's location. And then you have this exchange between him and Kenobi, where Kenobi says, the boy should be trained. And then Owen says, like the way you trained his father. That is a really good line. It makes perfect sense because of everything that Owen knows. You can understand why he'd be angry at Obi-Wan, because what he knows is that Obi-Wan failed to train Anakin, and then Anakin became Darth Vader. Owen doesn't know everything that we know or that Obi-Wan knows. And what we see in this series is Owen genuinely does care about Luke. And even in the season finale, he allows Obi-Wan to see Luke. And I love the fact that when Owen and Beru learn that Reva is coming, Beru is just casually like, "Hey Owen, can you go and get some guns that I have hidden behind a flower shrub?" She says that like it's no big deal at all. It's like, wow, Beru is actually awesome. I think this is great to see because when you think back to A New Hope, Owen and Beru don't have much screen time, and Owen's purpose in that movie is really just to be an obstacle for Luke. His purpose is really just to stand in the way of Luke leaving the farm. And therefore, Owen is rather one-dimensional character in that movie. You don't see Owen actually being a caring uncle, but books and comics that came out after the fact have done a good job of fleshing out Owen's character. Then we see that in this series. Also, I enjoy seeing Alderaan again because we don't see it all that often. It makes its destruction in A New Hope more tragic. I enjoy seeing Bail and Bria, especially Bria, because she does not have much screen time. I enjoy seeing Bail as well, because he's always been an important character, but one that doesn't have as much screen time. But overall, I was not impressed with the show. I really feel like Disney cheaped out with this show, especially now that I've seen Andor. I think in a way that makes Kenobi worse. Because when I look at Andor, I'm like, okay, I feel like a lot of time, money, and effort were invested into this show. Whereas when I watch Kenobi, I feel like not a lot of time, money, and effort was invested into this show. And visually speaking, particularly in episode 3, Kenobi doesn't look very good because it looks more small. But moving on now to number 19, we have The Last Jedi, which is a very divisive, polarizing film. It's one that I don't feel belongs in the Skywalker saga. The reason for that is because Rian Johnson's whole approach here is a complete deconstruction, burn everything to the ground. But I don't think that's a good idea in movie 8 out of 9. I don't think that's a good thing to do right before the conclusion to the Skywalker saga. And it also baffles me that the way Disney decided to approach this trilogy was to allow J.J. Abrams to come in with The Force Awakens and set up all these mystery boxes without any definitive plan in place for how to pay off all that intrigue that The Force Awakens set up. And then they brought this just some random guy, Rian Johnson, in for Last Jedi and just said, you have complete creative freedom to do whatever you want. So Rian Johnson came in and just threw in the trash all those mystery boxes. But then The Rise of Skywalker ended up retconning The Last Jedi. So I don't understand why Disney approached it the way they did. But when it comes to The Last Jedi in particular, I do not like at all the way that Luke is portrayed in this film, because I think there's just too much of a gap between the end of Return of the Jedi and The Last Jedi. What we see in Return of the Jedi is Luke is this hopeful, optimistic hero who doesn't give up on anyone. He didn't give up on his father, who, by the way, had been a Sith for decades and had committed many horrific crimes and atrocities, and yet Luke never gave up hope in his father. He made it clear to his father, I believe in you no matter what. And at the end of the day, Luke saved the galaxy because of his optimism. But then what we see in The Last Jedi is just Luke is jaded, cynical, grumpy. He doesn't want anything to do with it, with everything that's going on. He is incredibly mean to Rey, and what we learn the backstory is that he had the thought in his head for a second of killing his nephew, even though he didn't give up on his father, and even though when Luke decided to look into his nephew's mind, he must have known that he was going to see darkness, and yet somehow the darkness was so terrible that it caused Luke to overreact so badly. So, and so Ben thinks that Luke is trying to kill him, and then he and some of the other he and some of the others run off to join Snoke in the First Order. The worst part here is that after this happens, Luke decides to just do nothing about it at all. He doesn't in any way, shape, or form try to stop Ben Solo from running off to join Snoke in the First Order. No, he just turns his back on his family and friends during their greatest hour of need. He decides to throw in the towel. He goes to an island to die. He mopes, wallows in self-pity, and in an incredibly cold-hearted, selfish, and uncaring move, he both turns his back on his family and friends as well as the galaxy as a whole, because he just sits back and does absolutely nothing while the galaxy is plunged back into darkness. And I know that some people out there like this idea of fallen heroes that's explored in The Last Jedi. I mean, on paper, I think that's an idea that is worth exploring, but I don't think it was done well at all in this film. Also, I do not like at all the weird, pointless Canto Bite subplot. I don't know why that rabbit trail was included in this film, because it's just a weird it's a weird rabbit trail that's totally pointless and a waste of time. Plus, I do not like the fact that this movie tries to paint Poe as the one in the wrong, even though I would say that Poe wasn't the one in the wrong. Hodo was, because she should have just said what her plan was right away, and she was giving that speech to everyone. She could have said something like, I have a plan. I can't say it is right now for X reasons, but I do have a plan. That would have done a lot to reassure Poe that she wasn't either an incompetent idiot at best or a traitor at worst. Instead, Hodo shows a staggering level of rudeness and just acts belligerent toward Poe. She's condescending, talks down to him, even though he's the one who blew up Starkiller Base like a day before The Last Jedi. He was the one who was sent by Leia to retrieve the map to find Luke, and he's a great starfighter pilot who's very well respected. But yet, despite all that, Hodo acts like Poe is just an incompetent buffoon. Like, oh, look at this guy over here. He's just a flyboy. We don't need him at all. And Hodo makes it seem like she's going to get everyone killed, which is a really, really bad idea considering how dire the situation truly is in this movie. It's incredibly dire because the resistance is so utterly pathetic in this movie that it's comical. The fact that 400 people are the only ones left fighting the First Order in a galaxy as humongous as the Star Wars galaxy, where there are billions, trillions of citizens. 400 is nothing. Nothing at all. That's point zero, like less than 1%, something like that, of the galaxy fighting back. They only have just a couple of ships. They don't even have just have X-wings and A-wings, and plus all the resistance ships in this movie are running out of fuel, and if they completely run out, they'll be destroyed. Yet Hodo still decides to not say what her plan is, keep almost everyone in the dark, which would obviously cause morale to grow weaker, and she's staggeringly rude and condescending toward Poe, who's a very well respected member of the Resistance. This causes Poe to launch a mutiny, and I find it astonishing that when Hodo has a gun pointed to her face, she doesn't say, Poe, just come aside with me. Let me tell you my plan. Let's go somewhere private and I'll tell you. Instead, she just says, Oh, nothing I can do about that. I guess you're in charge, Poe. I don't get that at all. And as I mentioned earlier, Hux is just ruined by this movie because in The Force Awakens, he seems like a threatening villain, but in The Last Jedi, he is just an incompetent buffoon who's always played at the butt end of a joke. And the humor in this movie I find to be really distracting, especially at the beginning when you have a your mom joke and the BB-8 plugging the various sockets on a ship, which is the equivalent to plugging the holes in a dam. It felt like humor out of a Marvel movie rather than a Star Wars movie. Recent Marvel movies, especially, have this very quippy sense of humor, and I felt that here in The Last Jedi. So this movie feels very much like an outlier to me because it's trying to burn everything to the ground right before the conclusion. And so The Rise of Skywalker basically with a new came up with a new story because there was nowhere left to go really at the end of The Last Jedi. For that reason, this movie feels more to me like the third film in a trilogy rather than the second film in a trilogy, which I find to be really bizarre. And the way the film ends, I find to be really bizarre as well, because so many people in this movie die. So many of our good guys die. By the end, there's only 12 of our good guys left alive on the Millennium Falcon, and yet the Millennium Falcon is zipping along in hyperspace, which visually indicates adventure and excitement. And inside, everyone's smiling, laughing, having a good time. It's like, what? Didn't 300 or so resistance members die? Why is everyone so happy and celebrating? Everyone should be shell shocked actually about what happened. I mean, everyone should just be in silence while funeral dirge is playing. The tone of the ending is so bizarre, and I feel like this movie teased a more interesting direction for the trilogy to go in that they didn't end up going with. So after Kylo kills Snoke, Rey and Kylo fight the Praetorian Guards. After they're finished fighting them, Kylo reveals that he did it actually just to take control, to take the throne for himself, basically. He offers Rey to join him. He says, let's get rid of the old way of things and move on to the new way of things. And yet, immediately, the movie goes right back to he's using the First Order to chase down the Resistance, and she's against him. I don't know why it is that they went back. I don't know why it is that they went back in the safe direction rather than really doing something different. But moving on now, coming in at number 18, we have the Book of Boba Fett, a show that I am really baffled by because it has 2 episodes in it. There's only 7, by the way. There are 2 episodes in it that are not about the title character at all. They are basically the first 2 episodes of Mandalorian season 3, and yet they're in the Book of Boba Fett for some reason. If almost everyone is saying that the best 2 episodes of your show are the episodes that are not about the title character of the show, that's a really bad sign. And I also am baffled by how much our title character Boba Fett is outshined in his own show. He's outshined by Fennec Shand, and then Din Djarin or the Mandalorian comes in and steals his thunder. And the first 3 episodes of the show, first 4 episodes, wasted so much time with red herrings. For so long, we as the audience weren't sure who the bad guy actually is. It was so nebulous. It's like, wait, is it the mayor? Is it these huts? Who exactly is the bad guy? And they wasted so much time with red herrings, and for a long time, we were just not sure where's the story really heading, what direction is it going in, and the series moved at such a slow pace where so little was happening. We weren't sure who the villains were, that it was just boring to watch. Another big problem with this show is that it's set entirely on Tatooine, which is a very visually drab location that's just boring, uninteresting to look at. Now, there are things I enjoy about the show. For example, I like seeing Black Chrysanthemum. That's really clever because he originally appeared in the Darth Vader comics only. Then he shows up in this show. It works really well because if you haven't read the comics, then you're not confused. You're like, okay, that's a big Wookiee that at first works for these twin huts, but then ends up working for Boba Fett. You get it. It makes complete sense. But if you've read these comics, then it's a really good payoff that, okay, this character who was originally only in the comics has now made his way to the big screen. And I enjoyed that in the finale, we got to see Boba Fett riding a Rancor. That's fun to watch. And I also like that we got to see the location of Tashi Station. That's a really good callback because back in A New Hope, Luke says that infamous line, I was going to go to Tashi Station to pick up some power converters. So we get to see that. And we actually, in this place, get to see, there are these 2 people in the background that don't say anything, but their names are actually Cammy and Fixer. These characters actually only appeared before Book of Boba Fett in deleted scenes from A New Hope. These scenes established that they were Luke's friends, along with Big Starklighter, who actually does appear in A New Hope. So it was good seeing them again. I like the idea of fleshing out the Tuskens, showing them as more than just savage monsters, which is how they're portrayed in the films. And I also like that in the finale we saw these 2 big droids that had shields, big guns. That was really cool because they originally were just concept art for Attack of the Clones that weren't used, but then we actually do get to see them. But, however, I don't understand what the people behind the show were thinking when they decided that, for example, we're going to bring in Cad Bane at the end of episode 6, then he'll appear in episode 7, rather than him showing up from the beginning and being the clear villain from the start of the show. Especially considering that when you watch the Clone Wars, you realize that Cad Bane knows Boba Fett because he knew him when he was a child. So there is absolutely a history there. But disappointingly, this show does not address the history between Boba Fett and Cad Bane at all. And I also don't understand why it is that the people behind this show thought that we're not going to make it clear that the Pikes are actually a serious threat that urgently need to be stopped until the end of episode 6, the episode right before the season finale. Before that, it was just like, oh, okay, the Pikes are out there, they're bad, but it doesn't seem like they're a serious threat that we really need to be worried about or that they urgently need to be defeated. No, it's just they're out there. And then in the finale, our heroes are fighting against these generic, faceless, disposable, cannon fodder Pike members who just get mowed down and we don't care. They don't even establish a leader of the Pikes. And then when Fennec Shan takes out the Pikes, it doesn't mean anything. We don't care at all when we see it. It's just like, okay, whatever. Fennec Shan defeated them, but it doesn't matter. And then at the end of episode 4, Boba Fett has this dinner with these heads of families. He tells them to remain neutral. They say that this is a favorable agreement that we agree to. But then in the finale, they betray Boba Fett. It should be a big deal. But however, in this series, when it happens, we don't care. We don't find it to be a big deal. It's just like, oh, okay, these shady people who didn't seem trustworthy from the beginning betrayed him. Whatever, who cares? That's not a good sign at all. That just says that your show was not at all well constructed. And it wasn't until the end of episode 4 where we as the audience felt excited to watch the next episode, because that's when we knew, oh, Mando's going to be in the next one. But before then, when you got to the end of episode 1 or the end of episode 2 or the end of episode 3, for a lot of people out there, it's like, okay, I'll watch next week's episode, but I'm not overly excited about it. I mean, whatever. Also, another problem here is that there's 2 different timelines in this show, at least in the first several episodes. You have the past timeline where Boba gets out of the Sarlacc pit and then he meets the Tuskens, and then the present day timeline. I think having 2 timelines was a big mistake and meant that both of them were underdeveloped because there wasn't enough time. And with regard to the Tusken plotline, the big problem here is that the Tuskens are all killed off and they don't end up coming back as the cavalry in the season finale, which is what I thought was going to happen. It's like, okay, I think this is going somewhere. The Tuskens are going to show up as the cavalry, and then Boba Fett is going to negotiate a peaceful agreement where the Tuskens will be treated better. But that didn't end up happening. So ultimately, I was just left feeling, why were these Tusken flashbacks included? What was the point of them? The Tuskens were just killed off anyway. They don't come back as the cavalry. So these scenes are pointless, and it caused the show to feel stretched out even more than it already did. So there are things I enjoy about this show, but I don't like it very much at all. I mean, when it comes to Episode 6. Do I like seeing Ahsoka, R2, Cad Bane, Luke Skywalker, Cobb Vanth? Yeah, I enjoy seeing them again. That's nice. That episode fits fine. It's just an episode of the Star Wars show, but it doesn't fit as an episode of Book of Boba Fett. It doesn't fit in this show because it's a rabbit trail. So I found that to be so bizarre. On the, I mean, I liked seeing Luke training Grogu. That was cool to see. I like that we got to see it, but was just thinking, why is this here? The fact that the creators of the show were so disinterested, and even the people watching the show were so disinterested in the main plot line that we're all fine with there being the first 2 episodes of Mando season 3 in this show. That's a really bad sign when so many people are saying, yes, these episodes are great for the obvious reasons, because we get to see Mando again. We learn more about the armor, the other members of this Mandalorian cult. We learn about how they feel about Bo-Katan. And then, we see the dark saber again. We learn more about how the dark saber works. And then episode 6, we see Luke training Grogu. We see all these familiar characters again. So a lot of people have said those episodes are great for the obvious reasons, but the fact that we're saying that when these 2 episodes don't feature Boba Fett at all, it's a really, really bad sign. It says that many people out there are just not interested in the main plot line. And the fact that the creators chose to have those 2 episodes in there, I don't get that at all. But however, moving on, number 17 is The Force Awakens. Now, the reason why I placed this movie above The Rise of Skywalker and The Last Jedi is I think this movie is more entertaining and cohesive than the other 2 movies in the sequel trilogy. But I also feel like this movie really screwed over the sequel trilogy from the starting gate. I mentioned earlier that J.J. Abrams set up all these mystery boxes in this film, but he had no idea of how he was going to pay them off. Another big problem here is that the movie does not make it clear at all what the political status quo is. We know that the First Order has gained powers and strength somehow, then they're fighting the resistance, but there's so many questions, however, they're not answered in this movie. For example, how did the First Order gain strength? Also, why is it that the New Republic is not fighting the First Order directly? Why is it that this resistance, basically the Rebel Alliance all over again, is the one opposing the First Order, not the New Republic? Why isn't it the New Republic military that's fighting the First Order? Also, how is it that the New Republic was so wildly inept and incompetent that they allowed this new empire to gain power and strength right under their nose? How is it that the First Order was able to gain power while the New Republic was the reigning government in charge of the galaxy? Also, how is it that the First Order had the resources, manpower to create a superweapon even bigger than the first 2 Death Stars? How is it that they were able to create the Starkiller Base right under the nose of the New Republic, while the New Republic was the reigning government? Also, what really bothers me here is that we hear the New Republic is mentioned in the opening title crawl, then Hux mentions them later, so we know the New Republic is out there, but we don't learn about the New Republic in this film, and then it's all just destroyed by Starkiller Base, so everything resets back to the status quo, which we've already seen before. That's one of the big problems here is we're right back to big powerful empire versus small scrappy band of rebels. Again, we already saw that in the original trilogy. But here's the real problem here. In the original trilogy, the rebels were fighting to restore the republic. That was their ultimate goal. That was what they were fighting for. And yet this movie so incredibly sidelines the New Republic. That's just in the background. We don't know anything about it. We see the capital planet for literally a few seconds before it's blown up. That's it. It astonishes me just how much this movie throws the New Republic under the rug. And what also bothers me so much about the sequel trilogy, it starts off here, is how thoroughly it undermines the victory that the good guys earned at the end of Return of the Jedi. Because at the end of Return of the Jedi, the Empire is defeated, the Sith are gone, and we're left to assume that a new Jedi Order and New Republic will be created, and therefore there will be peace again. But The Force Awakens right away undermines that, and it says that victory the good guys earned at the end of Return of the Jedi, it actually didn't end up mattering at all. I mean, there were 30 years of peace, but you know what? In the Star Wars universe, 30 years is nothing. I repeat, nothing at all. Because the Republic stood for 2,500 years. 2,500 years, to be clear. 30 is nothing. So the film tells us, only 30 years after the good guys won at the end of Return of the Jedi, it's all gone back to how it was at the start of the original trilogy. I mean, the Empire's back. The rebels are weak again, especially at the end of this film after the Republic planets are blown up. Everything really is back to how it is at the start of the original trilogy. It's like, oh, okay, that victory that the good guys earned at the end of Return of the Jedi, that it doesn't matter anymore because the Empire is back. The rebels are actually weaker than they were before, for that matter. The Republic, they fought so hard to restore, just gone. It doesn't matter. And the Jedi Order that Luke fought to restore as well, that Jedi Order is just gone. It's gone before the events of the sequel trilogy, actually, so it doesn't matter. That is something I really do not like at all. And as many people have talked about before, this movie is so similar to A New Hope. It's such a rehash. I'm not going to go into all the similarities because they've been talked about to death, and so a lot of you watching certainly already know them by now, so it's not a need to go over them all in detail. But it astonishes me that this movie is so lazy that we have a third Death Star. That is so incredibly lazy. We have a super weapon again. And then when it comes to Finn, what really makes me sad here is there is a ton of potential with Finn. He could have been such an interesting character, but all that potential was sadly just wasted in this trilogy. We see that in this movie. So Finn defects from this new empire because Poe shoots one of the other stormtroopers, and then that stormtrooper leaves a bloody handprint on Finn's helmet, and he ends up taking off that helmet. So I want to start by saying I really like the idea of humanizing stormtroopers, making them more than just cannon fodder, making them more than just mindless automatons, which is how they've always been portrayed. They've never been human at all. But here they actually are, and I'm a big fan of that. But all the potential here is just wasted. For example, it would have been much more interesting if we actually saw Finn show some hesitation or being saddened afterward by the knowledge that he's killed stormtroopers that he knew for so long and were basically family to him. Because keep in mind, all these stormtroopers were kidnapped as babies, taken into First Order, and then brainwashed. So the only family, quote unquote, they would have been their fellow troopers. So for Finn, he should have an emotional connection to these other stormtroopers, and that should not be so easy for him to forget. But yet, you don't get that impression at all from watching the sequels, because Finn never shows any kind of hesitation at all when it comes to firing at stormtroopers. He never shows any amount of sadness or regret about killing these stormtroopers that he knows are victims, just like he was. He knows that they are all in the same boat. None of them chose this life. It was forced upon them against their will because they were kidnapped and raised as child slaves, basically. And yet we don't ever once see Finn advocating for stormtroopers, trying to tell other people that, look, these stormtroopers are not evil. They are victims. They were brainwashed. They were kidnapped and raised as child slaves. They were raised in this very strict military environment, and they were stripped of any kind of individuality, any kind of humanity, because they constantly have their helmets on, so they don't have a face, and they aren't given names. They're only given numbers. So at that point, they might as well be droids. They're practically not human anymore. Yet we never see Finn try to advocate for the stormtroopers. We never hear Finn try to say that maybe other stormtroopers could turn away like I did. It would have been so much more interesting if we got to see Finn and other stormtroopers defect. I mean, we got to see some stormtroopers that have defected in The Rise of Skywalker, but because that movie has such bad pacing, moves at such breakneck speed, that is barely explored in the movie. It's just there for a little bit, but if that had been in the trilogy earlier, it would have been so much more interesting. When it comes to Rey, the problem I have with her in the Force Awakens is that she's almost never in a position of vulnerability, or almost never makes any mistakes. I mean, when she's in the forest and is held in place by Kylo, that's one of the only moments where she's in a position of vulnerability, but that's pretty much it. I mean, when it comes to her making a mistake, I mean, yeah, she does make a mistake in the Falcon where she accidentally releases all these Ramphars, but that actually ends up helping out our heroes because that allows them to escape from all these gangsters. There's also almost never a situation where Rey has to be rescued by someone else. I mean, we do see it at the end of The Force Awakens where Chewie comes in with a Falcon and then Rey gets on it, but that's one of the only times where she's ever rescued by anyone else. And then what also bothers me here is that Rey is showing up Han Solo, the lifetime owner of the Millennium Falcon, someone who knows the Falcon better than anyone, and yet the scavenger girl is showing him up. Another thing that actually bothers me a lot with this film is that they missed out on their chance to have our original three characters, Luke, Han, and Leia, the core trio of the original trilogy, be together again. Han Solo's killed at the end of this film, and then Luke is off somewhere else. So we don't get to see in the sequel trilogy Luke, Leia, and Han together. That is something I'll never understand. That is so baffling to me because it should be so obvious that, yeah, fans want to see that. Why would we not want to see our free original trilogy characters, Luke, Han, and Leia, together on screen? And you can't, if you do it again, it's not going to be the same because because at this point it's not clear whether Mark Hamill or Harrison Ford would want to come back, and now Carrie Fisher's dead. And I mean, yeah, you can bring these characters back for CGI, but it's just not the same. With the decisions they made in this film, killing off Han, having having Luke be far away and separated from Leia and Han, they missed out on their opportunity for that great moment that would have made so many people very happy. Also, I do not like at all how this trilogy portrays our three original trilogy heroes as old, sad, miserable failures. Han Solo failed to be a father to his child, and then he abandoned his wife Leia and best friend Han. And he went back to being a selfish, he went back to being a selfish smuggler, and he turned his back on the resistance and the New Republic. He's still running these jobs despite his age. That made me just so incredibly sad. And then it's so sad to me to see Leia as an older woman still leading the Rebel Alliance, basically, still leading a small, scrappy resistance movement. She's already been through this before. She's still doing it at that age, and she's separated from Han. Luke is far away. Her son turned to the dark side. It's so incredibly sad. And then I talked about Luke before, how he's the old, sad, miserable failure. So moving on now at number 16, we have we have The Phantom Menace, which is a movie that I find to be so incredibly boring to watch. The reason for that is because all the characters except like young Anakin, Jar Jar, talk in the same dull, dry, boring, flat, monotone way where there's no emotion in their faces at all. They just have these emotionless poker faces throughout the entire movie. And so you're just tapping your foot waiting for someone to change facial expression or the tone of their voice. And on top of that, the characters just don't seem to care about what's actually happening. So when our main Jedi are fighting off these droids, they just act like it's no big deal at all. Like, for example, when the Jedi, along with the Queen, all her escorts, are getting to this hangar, Captain Panica is like, there's too many of them. Qui-Gon just says, won't be a problem. And then when Jar Jar, Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan are on that Gungan transport, they get attacked by various creatures. Jar Jar's panicking while Qui-Gon's like, relax, it'll be fine. It's like, okay, if they don't care about what's happening, if they don't think it's no big deal, then why should we? So we don't care about what's happening because the characters don't act like it's any big deal at all. So what reason do we have to get emotionally invested? Especially when you get to the scenes on Coruscant. They are just so incredibly boring, both because of the focus on politics, but also because of the flat and monotone way in which everyone is talking. They're talking like a robot, not a human being. And Jar Jar is also incredibly annoying. And I don't like young Anakin either. Also, I don't like the midichlorians because I don't like the Force being turned into something that's readable, something that can be measured. I prefer the Force to be purely mystical, but that purely mystical nature is undermined by the midichlorians. Also, this film introduces the idea that Anakin doesn't actually have a father, that when Shmi gave birth to Anakin, it was an immaculate conception or a virgin birth. I don't like the very obvious religious symbolism there, because basically tells us that Anakin is this messiah figure because he was born of a virgin birth. I don't like that because it makes it seem like Anakin is so incredibly important to this whole universe that he's this key holding everything together. I don't think that's necessary at all. Plus, this whole idea of a prophecy. This was never mentioned in the original trilogy. It's not explained in the prequels either. It's like, okay, who created this chosen one prophecy? Where and when? What does bringing balance to the Force even mean? Exactly. Another big problem here is that Darth Maul doesn't have a character at all. The reason why I say that is that he does not do much for most of the film. He stands around most of the time. He doesn't say much. He only has a couple lines of dialogue. We know almost nothing about him just from this film. I know that people like Darth Maul because he looks cool. He has this awesome lightsaber. He looks intimidating. Yeah, that's true, but there's just nothing here. He doesn't have a character. And what I also find to be so baffling is that Darth Maul is so stupid that he doesn't realize, I could kill this Jedi by just, swinging my lightsaber upward as he's jumping over me so that I could cut him in half. No, instead, Darth Maul, for some reason, just allows Obi-Wan to jump over him and then cut him in half. Also, yeah, those are the major problems I have. Those are the major problems I have with with a Phantom Menace. Also, all right, so I will say the Duel of the Fates score is fantastic. I like the choral voices throughout the score, the way that it starts soft and then gradually gets louder and louder. I like I like that score. And I mean, I think the fight it when it comes to the fight, I think it's well choreographed, but it's just a problem of Darth Maul having not having any character. But but moving on though, coming in at number 15, we have Star Wars Attack of the Clones, which is a movie that I think is slightly less bad than The Phantom Menace, but I don't think is much better. I think the love story here is really bad. Also, Anakin Skywalker is intensely unlikable in this film because he whines so much throughout this movie. He's constantly complaining about Obi-Wan behind his back. He acts so incredibly creepy, stalkerish toward Padme. Like for example, when he stares at Padme in such a creepy way that she says, "Please stop looking at me like that." He goes, "Why not?" She says, "It makes me uncomfortable." And then he goes, "Sorry, my lady." And oh, yikes, the facial expression, it's quite scary. And then on Naboo, he touches Padme's exposed back without permission, and on top of that, he advocates for a totalitarian government when he says the problem when there's this exchange between Padme and Anakin where Padme is like, the trouble is that people don't always agree. Anakin says, then they should be made to. And Padme says, who's going to do that? You? Well, someone. That sounds an awful lot like a dictatorship to me. Well, if it works. So Anakin is literally advocating for fascist dictatorship, and he also kills Sand people, including women and children, which is something that he literally tells Padme. You'd expect at that point she would bolt out of there immediately, go to her ship, and just leave. You expect at that point she would just cut ties with this creepy, creepy guy who just did something absolutely horrible. Yet for some reason she barely reacts, instead saying to be angry is to be human. In the end, she even marries Anakin. Despite all that, I don't get at all what Padme saw in Anakin in the first place. I don't know why it is she fell in love with him in the first place or married him in the first place. Especially considering that on top of everything I just said, when Padme and Anakin are both in the Queen's palace on Naboo, Anakin has the nerve to interrupt Padme right in front of the new Queen of Naboo. He then loses his temper and finally gives a forced apology. And also right at the beginning, he gives this incredibly forced and inappropriate compliment to Padme, and then he starts arguing with Obi-Wan right in front of Padme. Yet, despite all this, for some reason, Padme still falls in love with him anyway. Also, a big problem here, like all the sequels, is a big over-reliance on computer-generated imagery, CGI, rather than practical effects. It causes this movie to very much feel fake rather than real. Also, a big problem here is that our main villain in this movie, Count Dooku, does not show up on screen until an hour and 35 minutes in. Even though this is a 2 hour, 15 minutes, something like that movie, our main villain does not show up on screen until over halfway through the movie. And he's only indirectly connected to these plot lines that are going on. And another big problem here is that there are several different plot lines in this film. You got Padme and Anakin falling in love. You have Obi-Wan doing this investigation, but there's not one central plot line we're moving toward. So there's a lack of urgency and forward momentum, which causes this movie to be not all that entertaining. Also, just like The Phantom Menace, it's not clear who the main character is supposed to be. On the one hand, Obi-Wan seems kind of the more relatable character because he's not advocating for a dictatorship or killing sand people, men, women, and children. But he's also very distant because he's a Jedi, so he's kind of cold. Though admittedly, Ewan McGregor does absolutely give a good performance. But on the one hand, it kind of seems like Obi-Wan's the main character, but it also kind of seems like Anakin's the main character. We're not sure. Just like with the Phantom Menace as well, where it's not clear who the main character is either. In fact, with the Phantom Menace, I'm not sure who that movie is supposed to be aimed for. I'm not sure what the target audience is, because the movie has very juvenile humor with Jar Jar Binks that's there for 5-year-olds. That includes Jar Jar stepping on poop and hearing a fart. But then the film also has these dull, dry, boring scenes of political discussion that kids are not going to find entertaining. So I'm not sure who that movie is meant to be aimed for. But going back to episode 2, when it comes to The opening scene, there's a lot of stupidity on display. For example, considering that Padme knows that she's under threat of assassination, you'd think that Padme would value her safety above anything else. But instead, it doesn't seem like that's the case because Padme, for some reason, thinks it's remotely a good idea to sleep in a bedroom where the blinds are open. This would leave her vulnerable to attack, vulnerable to being killed, and yet Padme decides to do it anyway, even though if a rocket or a missile or blaster had been fired at the building, then it would have been much more hard to survive that. Also, right after Anakin and Obi-Wan come into the room and kill the worms that were going to kill Padme, Obi-Wan, for some reason, decides to jump out a window to grab the probe droid. But here's the problem. Obi-Wan did not know that he was going to be able to catch the probe droid in time before falling to his death. Two, he did not know if the probe droid was going to be able to support his weight. Three, he did not know that the probe droid was not a bomb that would have exploded when he grabbed it. And then Anakin gets on a speeder and it locates the he chases the bounty hunter, and that leads us to this moment where Anakin jumps out his speeder when there's a ton of other speeders flying around everywhere, and he somehow on one speeder out of millions that is the right one. He somehow lands on the one speeder that contains the bounty hunter that they're looking for. That is utterly absurd. And on top of that, the fact that that Anakin is so unconcerned that he's fine with falling from enormous heights to try to catch one speeder out of millions, billions, who knows how many, that means that it's hard for us to care as well because that character doesn't care, isn't treating this like it's any kind of big deal at all. In fact, earlier on, when Obi-Wan was riding this probe droid, he didn't look remotely concerned either, just like Anakin. He had this blank expression on his face that didn't communicate that he was worried in any way. It just communicated actually that he was bored. Same thing with Anakin. And so it's hard for the audience to get emotionally invested when our characters are not. Now, Anakin and Obi-Wan eventually chase the bounty hunter down to this bar. They then go into the bar, and for some reason, Zam Wessel, the one that they're looking for, decides to pull a gun in order to try to kill one of the Jedi. This was really, really stupid because she easily could have escaped. She could have blended amongst the crowd or tried to find some kind of secret backdoor escape route. So she could have easily escaped. But instead, for some reason, she decided not to do that. She decided to try to kill a Jedi, even though she should have known that there was no way she was going to succeed in doing that. And in doing so, she completely blew her own cover. Also, we learn that Zam Wessel was hired by Jango Fett. But you'd think that since Jango Fett is an experienced bounty hunter and assassin, he would just do the job himself and not delegate it to someone else. Also, using worms was really, really stupid because the bad guys could have decided to use a blaster, a rocket, a missile, a grenade, something like that, in order to kill Padme, and that would have been so much more effective than worms. But moving on from that, Obi-Wan ends up going to this place called Camino, where he meets these Kaminoans who have been growing a clone army. And while he's there, we learn about this guy named Sifo Dyas, who supposedly is the Jedi Master that ordered the clone army in the first place. There's this whole mystery set up about Sifo Dyas, because the big question here is: wait, is Sifo Dyas a real person? Even if he is real, is he actually the one who ordered the clone army? Was he actually a Jedi Master? Since Obi-Wan and Yoda and Mace Windu can't seem to agree on when he actually did die, we're left unsure. Was Sifo Dyas real, or is this all just a ploy by the Sith to cover their tracks? But that mystery is completely forgotten about in the prequels themselves. I know that's fleshed out more in the Clone Wars as well as books and comics, but in the prequels themselves, this mystery is just completely forgotten about. But moving on to number 15, we have Star Wars Revenge of the Sith, which I feel is the best out of the prequels. Like Attack of the Clones, I think that Ewan McGregor gives a great performance as Obi-Wan. Ian McDiarmid, as always, gives a great performance as Palpatine. Even when he starts to really ham things up as the movie goes on, it doesn't matter because he's having so much fun with this role that you just don't care. Also, all the prequels have great music, like Duel of the Fates and the Phantom Menace, and then Across the Stars, or the love theme from Attack of the Clones. But I would say this film in particular has fantastic score. For example, when it comes to the Order 66 sequence, on the one hand, all these Jedi that are being killed off are ones that we don't know from the prequels. We don't know who they are from these films, so we don't care about them. But however, the score that's played during this scene in the movie, called Anakin's Betrayal, so effective. It's a chilling and incredibly well composed piece of score from John Williams. It's dark, somber, tragic, perfectly represents the tragedy that we see occurring. In fact, this is one of the saddest of all the Star Wars movies, because in this one we see evil triumphing and good losing. But even though I think this is the least bad of the prequels, even though I think it's the best out of the three, for me that's not saying much. I still don't think this is a good film. I think that the acting and dialogue is still really bad, just like in Attack of the Clones. The visuals, once again, not very good. Also, Anakin in particular is really, really stupid in this film. But that extends to Obi-Wan in at least one case as well. So right at the beginning, Obi-Wan and Anakin go to rescue Palpatine. They find Palpatine, but then Dooku comes. Palpatine says, "Get help, you're no match for him. He's a Sith Lord." Obi-Wan turns around and says to him, "Chancellor Palpatine, Sith Lords are our speciality." Here's the thing, though. What Obi-Wan actually should have done there is turn around and say, wait a minute, Chancellor. Get help from where? From who? Who on the ship is going to help us? How do you know that Dooku is a Sith Lord? In fact, for that matter, how do you even know what a Sith Lord is? Obi-Wan should have been suspicious right there. And then Anakin ends up cutting off Dooku's head because Palpatine told him to. And then Anakin goes to get Obi-Wan, and Palpatine's like, Anakin, there's no time. We must get off the ship before it's too late. If he's going to be all right, leave him or we'll never make it. His fate will be the same as ours. That was a really stupid response. Instead, what Anakin should have done is say, wait a minute, what's the rush, Chancellor? Are you seriously saying we can't take 2 seconds to pick his body up? You're acting like a weirdo. First, you know what a Sith Lord is, then you tell me to execute an unarmed prisoner, and now you're telling me to leave Obi-Wan Kenobi, a Jedi Master who we've all known for decades, behind to die for no real reason when there's no real hurry. You're acting kind of suspicious. But no, instead, just like of Obi-Wan, this really, really suspicious comment for Palpatine just goes over Anakin's head for some reason. And then we get to the Opera House scene. Now, the story that Palpatine tells here is interesting. Again, Ian McDiarmid does a great job. The music is well done. But Anakin is being so stupid here because alarm bells should be ringing in his head that Palpatine is telling this old Sith legend. It's the equivalent of, as a certain other YouTube reviews put it, being in being in a casual conversation with someone that you've known for a long time, and then they just casually, like it's no big deal at all, say, oh yeah, I've been starting to read Mein Kampf. And if someone did that, you would raise your eyebrows and be like, wait, what did you just say about Mein Kampf? But instead, Anakin, for some reason, doesn't seem to be suspicious at all when Palpatine is being really suspicious. Anakin should be thinking, wait, why does this guy seem to hate the Jedi so much and love the Sith so much? Why does this guy know so much about the Sith? Anakin, you'd think, would be smart enough to put these pieces together in his mind. Wait, Palpatine's acting like a weirdo. Now he knows about this old Sith legend. He told me to leave Obi-Wan behind to die for no good reason. In fact, generally speaking, you'd think that Anakin would be able to figure out on his own that Palpatine is a Sith Lord because of how suspicious he keeps acting. But instead, for some reason, Anakin is too stupid to connect the dots in his mind. Instead, Palpatine has to all but scream in Anakin's ear, I'm a Sith, before Anakin actually figures it out. And then once Anakin figures out that Palpatine is the Sith Lord the Jedi have been looking for years, you'd think that Anakin would be smart enough to put the puzzle pieces together in his mind and think, this means that Palpatine is obviously the one behind everything. He's obviously the mastermind that has orchestrated all this. He's the one responsible for the Clone Wars, responsible for the blockade of Naboo, responsible for the attempts on Senator Amidala or my wife's life. Instead, for some reason, Anakin is seemingly too dumb to connect all these dots. And then Anakin goes to warn Windu about Palpatine being a Sith. So Windu and a couple of other Jedi go to confront Palpatine. What astonishes me here is the incredible amount of stupidity Mace Windu shows during this part of the film. Because you'd think that Mace Windu would realize, it might be a good idea to contact Master Yoda and tell him everything. And then it would be a smart idea for us to alert all the Jedi scattered throughout the galaxy of what's going on, so they can be in the loop, so they know what's going on and can prepare. You'd think that Mace Windu and Yoda would realize the smartest thing to do would be to contact all the other Jedi scattered throughout the galaxy and say, The Chancellor is the Sith Lord. We are moving in to arrest the Chancellor now. We are expecting severe resistance. Be prepared. Things might go wrong. Be prepared for the worst. If they had done this, more Jedi might have been able to survive Order 66. If the Jedi throughout the galaxy had been aware of what was going on, more of them could have survived. But instead, for some reason, Mace Windu doesn't realize that's a good idea to contact Yoda or any of the other Jedi. Instead, he and the three other Jedi that are with him rush to confront Palpatine right then and there. So they make the huge, huge mistake of confronting Palpatine in his private office with no witnesses and without the Jedi recording what has been going on here, and without them presenting evidence to the Senate about Palpatine's wrongdoings, or getting authorization from the Senate, for that matter, to actually arrest the Chancellor, who, as far as the Galactic Senate and general public are concerned, was the democratically and legally elected Chancellor of the Republic. No, instead, Mace Windu and the other Jedi rush to confront Palpatine. Then and there, they play right into Palpatine's hands, and thus make it so much easier for him to frame the Jedi as trying to illegally and unjustly assassinate him. And on top of that, after Palpatine's lightsaber has been kicked away by Mace Windu, and thus Mace has won the duel, Anakin comes in, and then Mace makes it clear he's going to kill Palpatine right then and there. He's going to murder him extrajudicially. You'd think that Mace Windu would realize that it's not necessary at all for him to do this big dramatic wind-up. He could just, in a few seconds, quickly stab Palpatine for the chest, not do an unnecessary dramatic wind-up. Also, you'd think that with how high the stakes truly are, that Mace would remember that Anakin is there, that he would try to keep Anakin calm, make it clear to Anakin that they are allies against Palpatine. But instead, Mace Windu shows a staggering amount of rudeness to Anakin. He seems to forget about him, which leads to Anakin protecting Palpatine. I'm going to continue this on a later date, but for now, bye.